What is up, theology nerds? This is Tripp, and today, returning to the podcast, is my buddy Andrew Root. Now, Andy and I get to hang out quite regularly because he's such an introvert and a super nerd. He drops new books all the time, and I keep liking them and enjoying them, and then want to talk to him again. But this one, not only does he have Baal on the cover and in the title, but he's making the connections to it that got me really excited. Normally, Andy is bringing together some of our favorite shared loves of German social theorists and philosophers and such, and then thinking through challenges like explicit to the life of the minister or the life of the church and these kinds of things. And there's always like that background hum of the critique of the economic system in that order. But today, this book, it makes it transparent and it makes it deeply intimate, and you see the connection between the two. That's why I love this book, not just because I love Andy or have enjoyed his other books, but this one does it with zest. All right? Now, before we jump in, I'm going to tell you something. Summer 2027, Andy Root, who went with me, we taught a class together in Bonhoeffer's house last summer. We're doing it again. So if you missed it, you're on the waiting list. Once it's live, I'll email you. Or you can go to bonhoeffertrip.com, where you can put your name in, email in, and then we'll tell you once tickets are available. But summer, June 2027, we're going back, and it's going to be a blast. There's going to be two different options. One session is going to be like deep dive into Bonhoeffer's life and formation and such, for more like personal spiritual questing, rethinking your vocation, engaging Bonhoeffer and his life and such as a clergy leader, faith leader, that kind of thing. And the other one is going to be like the more theology nerd version of the experience, where we're going to spend time in his house, like digging deep, like you read Bonhoeffer intensely before you get there, and we do more theology excitement and such. And it will be built in a way that if you wanted to do them both back to back, you could, because there's not going to be huge amounts of overlap, but there will be like more like his life movement and all that kind of stuff into like super nerdy stuff. If you've gone before, you can go to the second one and go into the nerdy stuff. Or if you were me and you're just picking, you're like, one of them we argue and talk and wrestle with Bonhoeffer's text extra time. Yes, that's one I would pick. But they'll both be there, bonhoeffertrip.com, and super excited to get to do this again. And I love getting to do it at Bonhoeffer's house. It's hard to exaggerate how cool that is. All right. Anyway, enjoy me, Andy, and getting down with Baal, or throwing down Baal. That might be better. Yeah, because it's a critique of the system and the idolatrous demands of an accelerating economic order that's exploiting the planet and extracting life and finitude from the poor. All right, enjoy.
Hello, everybody. This is Tripp. Andy Root is back on the podcast. And he's got a new book that may have came out when I release this, if I decide to wait and release it right when it comes out, because I'm nice. And I've decided I wanted to be nice because you're the first person to put a footnote in a book noting for me when I was reading it that there was indeed a Counting Crows reference for my enjoyment.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's going to be in the final version.
No, yes. I think it's going to be. Yeah, okay. It's going to be. Yeah. Yeah, I had a little allusion to Counting Crows, and then in the footnote said, this is just for Tripp.
Oh.
They've left it in there.
Yeah, I felt so seen. I
forgot all about that.
You didn't ask me to write anything for the back of the book, or I would have seen how many Counting Crows lines I could put in an endorsement without acknowledging them. It's a game. It's a game you can play.
Next one we'll play that game.
Okay.
That'll be very good.
But new book is called Baal and the Gods of More.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm pretty excited about it. I think every time, like every one of your books, you get more and more frustrated with neoliberal capitalism, and it gets more and more transparent. And this time, you decided to have the central thesis, or this is Tripp's quote of you that I'm saying is your central thesis. You can tell me I'm wrong. I think I made a list of 10 quotes, and I'm just going to read them to you, and then we'll talk about it.
Did you find these or did AI find these?
No, I read it. That's why I was texting you was last night.
I was just figuring AI was pulling these out for you and even writing those texts.
Oh, they were writing the. Oh, I wish. Then I find out in the middle of the conversation what we discussed about the interview. You're like, didn't you tell me? I thought we were going to discuss if my family was disappointed that we named our new puppy Khaleesi after the last season of Game of Thrones came out. That was another thing. I didn't pull the quote about naming your dog Khaleesi before.
No, that's our last
season.
That's our last dog. Yeah,
but you didn't know how the show was going to end when you
No,
named it.
we didn't. I think we got that dog like after season 2 maybe, or season 1 even. So then it was like she was awesome, and then we didn't know how it was going to end. So that was a problem.
I haven't seen the meme yet that has like Khaleesi on the dragon with all of King's Landing torched behind it, where someone is like photoshopped Trump's face on Khaleesi and just been like, oh, yeah. But anyway, your central thesis, this is Tripp's, you say, like the Israelites in Elijah and Hosea's day, we've come to assume Yahweh is driving us toward resource growth, rescuing us by way of resources, but that's not how Yahweh saves. So what is it that kind of attracts you to this narrative from Kings when thinking about the predicament of modernity and the way it expresses itself in the life of the church?
Yeah, I think this book was born from a podcast. I don't think it was yours, Tripp, but it was like
probably on a good podcast.
No. It was a subpar podcast. I'm sure somewhere. I don't remember which one it was, but I don't know. It was in the midst of an interview where we were, like a theme has been the way this kind of secular age demands, I think, for Protestant congregations that they think of decline as the loss of resources, hence the loss of people, the loss of relevance. And I don't know, I just kind of I was trying to make this point, and I said something like, I think when this happens, we get this kind of late modern form of Baalism kind of comes about, or we become enamored with fertility gods. And that just got me thinking about, okay, that is interesting. And so I guess that's what I'm trying to explore. I worry that the book with its title says like this is like I'm trying to flex some Old Testament scholar cred that I do not have. So I live in a bit of fear and trembling about that. But it really is trying to be a kind of cultural philosophical read in a kind of practical theological tone of thinking about what it means to live in a time where we're tempted by fertility gods in the sense that, like the Israelites in First and Second Kings, we can remember a golden era. I mean, I think Protestants can remember it, or their pastor remembers it. I mean, there's a sense like mid 20th century, or late 1960s, 70s. Everything was golden, and we've been on the downside of a golden age for a long time. And I think those two biblical texts kind of point to, when you're on the downside of a golden age, you start to think you can mix this God of Israel, this God made known on the cross of Jesus Christ, with just a little bit of fertility drives. And to your point, I think in late modernity, those become certain kind of growth-based capitalist drives that end up maybe making more problems than solutions. And, like we're on this podcast, and Tripp, you make a living doing this. So we're not, I think we both have some fears about the way capitalism plays itself out. We're both participating in it in a significant way. But I think kind of feeling on the downside of this golden age, or what we've called the Protestant century, or the Christian century, has led us to maybe try to do a kind of syncretism that is antithetical to at least one kind of Old Testament theology and a theology of the cross that continues to be a theme in my work.
Yeah, one of the elements that runs throughout the book, and I'd love for you to kind of unpack it a bit more, is that golden age element where, and now we're in a crisis of the golden age, right? So if American Protestantism currently has this withdrawal, we're suffering from a deep withdrawal from the special century, that post-war world where we just happen to have oceans between us and everyone else in the wars, and we're the ones that set up the post-war economic and political institutions, which have been really great for us, which is odd considering we're the ones throwing them under the bus currently. But nonetheless, we did that. And then we get to monetize the rebuilding of all the things that get blown up. We become central for trade, protection, military, sales, all kinds of stuff. And it seems that you're trying to say, like, yeah, America's self-identity of like the America we want to return to if we're getting great again is one that thinks it, in its own awesomeness, deserved this really special century. And it just flowed right out of the essence of what it means to be the free and liberal, amazing, open America. And that the mainline Protestantism and American Christianity in many ways has done something similar, where we attribute the growth and flourishing of churches in that time to spiritual faithfulness, in the same way the church, the country has with like kind of the economic conditions and such. And so can you kind of unpack that anxiety or the crisis that's taking place at so many levels, right? Like from the structural, political, economic to denominations or schools and stuff where we work, all the way down to kind of how it shows up in the individual to set us in the crisis that perhaps with the story that you've put it in, I don't know, we get a little bit more framing.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm trying to weave together three bands, I guess, here that then leads to this reading of First and Second Kings, and it really is this sense of the Christian century that comes about throughout the 20th century and in the height of Protestantism. And you can even think of this as like the height of civil religion, or the time like mid 20th century where the pastor was important. There's all these stories of if you went to seminary, say, in the even the 1970s, but for sure in the early 1960s or 50s, it was assumed like it was on par with being a doctor or going to med school. Like to be a Protestant pastor held a certain kind of cachet. But that reality of the Christian century, which we always say the Christian century, and have a publication based called the Christian century, but we've always really meant the Protestant century, really. So this Christian century links up with what you referred to, Robert Gordon, who is this, I would describe him as a kind of curmudgeonly economist from Northwestern University. He's written this incredibly thick book called The Rise and Fall of American Growth. And his basic thesis is really, I think, right on and fascinating, where he just says, like, from 1870 to 1970 was a special century. It was the American special century. And what it brought forth was like these huge amounts of GDP growth, where you would get more GDP growth in 2 years in the 1960s than you would get like in 500 years in the medieval period, when you look at this as a numerical number. And so there was like one of my examples of this is like the Jetsons just seem like a documentary to people in the 60s, because when you basically are at 3% real GDP growth, his point is that you're getting not just one double of living standard a generation, you're getting it twice. So there was a kind of thought in the mid 1960s that flying cars and all that Jetsons kind of stuff was just around the corner. But his basic point is like those are pushed by industrial revolutions. So you get the first industrial revolution that starts to have its distributions into the world in the 1870s, a decade or so after the Civil War. But then you get the second one. When that one wanes, you get a second one that comes about with electricity that happens, between the two great wars, and that just launches America, particularly, as you're saying, in control of all these kind of global realities after the Second World War, particularly, into huge amounts of growth. And I just think you can see how the special century and Protestantism kind of go together. And his point is this ends in the 1970s. Like this growth starts to in the mid 1970s starts to go away. And you start to see that's the very location when people start talking about the worry of mainline Protestantism. Like as soon as the special century comes to an end, that goes away. And he talks about these headwinds that start to come about. It leads to Reagan being elected. I mean, it leads to a certain rise that we're living right now with a kind of politicized evangelicalism too, because evangelicals become the kind of established Christian group, if you will. Like they start to take the mantle from the main line because they are more positioned to not be as dependent on the special century, or to think of the individual as having to create their own growth instead of the system creating it, And so you then get these huge churches that pop up that start to take over. But his basic point is that, we've been waiting for the third industrial revolution to come, and it does come. It comes out of Silicon Valley. It comes in this kind of digital platformed, industrial revolution, but it does not bring the growth that we saw with electricity, that we saw with the combustion engine. It just doesn't do it. It gives us more entertainment. I mean, here we are talking on, on Zoom or, whatever fancy software you have, Tripp, and people are listening to this on their phones, and we can stream every show and every sports league and things like that. But that doesn't seem to have the effect of bringing growth to the economy in the same way, at least not in a way that the whole system benefits from. I think billionaires here and there benefit from it. So the standard of living has gone down. And now most of us who grew up at some time during that special century had a deep sense, or our parents did, that we were going to have a higher standard of living than they would. And now Gordon's point is, for especially Gen Zers, they're really aware that that's not going to happen. And that really hasn't happened. One of the reasons millennials were so kind of positive and thought that they would, be CEOs of companies in the early 2000s was because they were living in the one little bubble of that GDP growth that happened from 95, I think, to 2005. Right in there, we had the same kind of growth for those 10 years that we had pre 1970, but that all popped, and it all popped with a dot-com bubble, which is what we think of it. And so we've been all living with this deep sense that, that standard of living is not going to double or even quadruple in our lifetime. And it leads to a great deal of discontent. And I think it's undercut political systems. And we live with this kind of dystopian reality. I mean, I think another thing you can see is all the dystopian movies, books, things like that really start to proliferate. Not, I mean, obviously you can think of, 1984 and things like that exist during the special century. But my gosh, from the late 90s into the 21st century, they are everywhere. It has something with this sense that we know we can't get back, but at a deep level, we'd love to get back to all that growth we had for that 100 years of the special century.
Yeah, in that element there of growth is something that's kind of trans institutions. So and I think that, in the book, that's one of the ways in which you incorporate Hartmut Rosa's work,
Yeah.
and the nature of dynamic stabilization by looking at how dynamic stabilization in kind of modern capitalism is like grow or die. And so it has this deep correlate to kind of the ancient fertility worship.
Yeah.
And it demands what all idols demand: sacrifice, energy, innovation, children, for the sake of yield. And what's interesting to me is how what a lot of people may be nodding their head to, right, when they think, oh, you're talking about how the economic system and neoliberalism made things worse. You're right. Yeah. You're right, Andy. Thank you for introducing me to Hartmut Rosa, and I appreciate this. You go, yeah, but it's not even just there. This engine of dynamic stabilization defines modernity in all the different places it shows up.
Yeah, it's everywhere. And I mean, I think that's the point that I'm really trying to take from Rosa that also started, it wasn't just a throwaway line in a podcast. I mean, it is this sense that I think one of Rosa's great contributions, I think one of his most genius theory constructions, is dynamic stabilization. And so his whole point is that your society is modern when it stabilizes itself dynamically by growth. And, I think his point is every society has to stabilize itself. There's no crime in stabilizing yourself. To make yourself contingent or exist across time, you need to find ways of stabilizing yourself. What's uniquely modern is to think the only way we can stabilize ourselves is if we grow. So the only way my seminary stays open is if we grow. If we grow what? If we grow capital. And that capital is going to be just pure financial money, but it's also going to be the capital of students. It's going to be the capital of reputation. It's going to be all those kind of forms of capital in a kind of Bourdieuian kind of way, And I think what's interesting, and as I try to read this with First and Second Kings, is Rosa calls this dynamic stabilization, he thinks, sits on top of what he calls the logic of escalation. This idea that you have to continue to escalate things. And when I do that, I don't even know if Hartman would agree with me, but I try to say, even say the Roman Empire or Alexander the Great, or here we are with kind of the post-Solomon period, there is a sense of the logic of escalation comes in. It's just what drives it and what makes them not modern is it's supposed to be the escalation of cultic activity. So that's why they look at like more worship of the gods, and why you get Elijah who like mocks them, can your gods hear you? Like essentially like expend more energy on cultic activity, and maybe then your God will wake up and hear you. And so there's a logic of escalation that I think, what I'm trying to say theologically, I'm not sure Yahweh functions in this kind of logic of escalation, because the logic of escalation will create in one form or another, it will enslave you. And it enslaves the Israelites in Egypt. It has enslaved us with plenty of places around the world. Globalization has enslaved people, but it also just enslaves us in the system of continuing to have to grow our personalities, continuing to have to grow our 401ks, continuing to have to grow our reach, continuing to have to grow our likes, to continue to have to grow our personalities, or we lose out. And that does lead us to kind of expend energy and to fall into this logic of escalation. And I think one of the kind of amazing things about the Judeo-Christian kind of expression is that the way of life is not embedded in just pure escalatory growth. And there may be something like growth, but that growth seems to be a growth into someone, into something, not a growth of something. And yet I think we all feel like, our churches, our denominations have no future unless they can extract some form of growth, and so then we jump on the dynamic stabilization, we concede to the logic of escalation, and then in the modern form, the only way to play that game is to do dynamic stabilization, which means you have to grow continually with never stopping until you crash.
At the beginning of the book, you use a meme, which I was not
I'm very old. Yeah.
No, you're hip. You used a meme.
Well, I don't know if I used it well, but yeah.
Well, I'm not going to assess that right now, Andy. But right there at the beginning, you introduce this binary of kind of instrumentality. Think Baal or Artemis, where people and the church all function in many ways as tools or means to the end of growth or resources accumulation or relevance, versus relationality. And in the meme, you get Mother Mary or Yahweh in the story from Kings, where the people are, their personhood is retained. They aren't a means to any end. They're an end in and of themselves. And it's that the mattering of them mattering, right, becomes primary. I think a lot of people will nod their head, be like, of course we love relationality, Andy.
Yeah.
We're Christians, and we want to be so relational, like really good at being relational, so that people want to be even more relational with us.
Right.
And we want to be invested in our community and relevant to our community and our relations. And so we start books with memes.
Yeah.
So can you kind of like just help us understand that that binary, but also like what are some of those kind of unexamined places within the life of Christians or parents or church leaders and such, where perhaps we haven't dwelt too long on the distinction to realize that we might be a little more instrumentally engaged than anticipated?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, this is a true story that I find very funny, and I think it should have been if I, was submitting something to SNL, I think this would be, I mean, it was fodder for sketch comedy that we took our kids to the Vatican Museum, and I think this has changed now, but this was, I guess, 23. And the only way really to avoid the lines and even get in was to book a tour. So we booked a tour with this like Italian woman who seemed like she smoked at least 2 packs a day. Like she was just, she was a character in herself. So we ended up getting teamed up with a bunch of other Americans, which was kind of disappointing, and 2 Spanish people who ditched the tour right away. Like they were just using the tour to get in the door and was like, I got to get away from these Americans. But it was a bunch of homeschool parents and with us because we had taken our kids out of school. So then they thought we were, kind of homeschoolers too. And, we're like, no, we're just irresponsible parents who take our kids out of school. But they were like a homeschool group. Yeah, from Denver or something. And the funniest thing that happened is we were in where all like the Hellenistic statues are, and there's Artemis, who's this statue with all of these breasts everywhere, like the ultimate fertility god, just breasts everywhere. And this homeschool mom goes, oh, what is that? Does she have eggs all over her? And this Italian tour guide goes, no, those are, and she was like looking for the English word. And she's like, no, those are teats. Those are teats. She has teats everywhere. And I was just dying laughing, like biting my lip. And the poor homeschool mom just turned bright red, was humiliated. Oh, okay. But there was something that was really informative to me about it. It's like what we want in a kind of late stage capitalism is just that kind of fertility. And, like almost every church conference I go to in many ways, there's a kind of sense where there's seminars where, like this innovation, you'll be able to extract the growth that you need out of it. And yet I think the thing that we miss is that there is a certain kind of, this is, I think, Tripp, what we share with Rosa is that there is a certain kind of action that this demands. And it's an action that demands this kind of accelerating mode of being that tends to see as a high level, the AAA, accessibility, attainability, availability. Like this is what you're trying to do. You're trying to make your church more accessible, more available, more attainable. And that can never stop. So you just have to keep doing that. And that's what's fascinating about Gordon is he's like, what happens coming out of the special century, what happened to bring the special century is you needed innovations. And our issue, like Gordon is a full-fledged, like growth-based economist. He just doesn't think we're good at it anymore. Like that, he's not against it. Like Rose is kind of against it. He's like, this will destroy us. It will destroy our soul. Gordon's kind of an American. He's like, we need it. We need it bad. We just suck at it. Like we're just failing at it. And all you kids who think you're going to find it, you're at good luck. But his whole point is that, that we have these techno optimists, and these techno optimists just think, well, maybe Silicon Valley hasn't given us the growth, but it's coming. It'll be AI or it will be robots or whatever. And I see that in the church all the time where it's like, oh, it's going to be one more program or one new way to do worship. And there's a certain kind of techno optimist kind of reality, but it shows that really what we think will save, to be very kind of Lutheran Protestant here, that we think what will save is growth itself, that we need growth to save us. And, after going into being in that kind of Hellenistic Greek wing of the Vatican Museum, going over to Renaissance paintings and seeing the Madonna and the Child, well, that's a very different picture of growth, as the Christ child is just looking at the Madonna, and the Madonna's kind of beckoning us to come and grow into this relationship. There's no accelerated growth there. There's no demand to do more with less in some ways. There's a sense of what it means to kind of surrender and lean into this kind of relationality. There's a dynamic that I think both you and I share that we get scared about mentioning, but there's a certain assertion that's right there in the Hebrew Bible as well as in the New Testament that you have to wait on this God. That like Psalm 46, be still and know I am God. You have to put down your hands and know this God and remember that God has elected to make you a child, and children don't have to produce to be. They are claimed as children. And it's a very different logic. And yet probably all of us who even see its problems feel like, well, yeah, but if we don't enter in, if we don't find some kind of techno optimist breakthrough, then we're all dead. Like, this whole thing explodes. And that is the fear we live with, because we don't have any kind of sense of what it means to be outside of escalatory growth. And that's what we judge even good institutions, self-fulfilled institutions, and self-fulfilled people. How much are you growing?
And when you're discussing that logic of escalation, assuming a biblical Christian can get past a positive reference to Marx, you get to the way in which, even within the life of the church, the kind of secular fertility infatuation shows up, where there's this logic of escalation that creates a closed loop with no end, where it's just like wanting to seize our attention, right? Or, money generates commodity and then more money. And part of that predicament isn't just like it's soul sucking and that kind of thing. You also emphasize that it doesn't have a grounding or a telos. Mm-hmm. That part of what we've internalized, it did so easily, I think, in the special century, is an engine without a grounding or a telos.
Right.
And that's, well, I would say a bit theologically problematic.
Yeah, deeply theologically problematic. Yeah,
I was saying it in an understated way, sarcastically.
I did get that. I did.
Okay.
I did get that. So sorry if I communicated that you didn't get that, Tripp. But yeah, I mean, I think that to me seems to be one of the more interesting things that we need to continue to take from Marx that has been really helpful, is that there was this historical change where you had commodities, you had money, you had commodities. So if you had corn, you could turn it into coin, and then you could, with that coin, you could get clothes, but the whole point was just to have the commodity. But Marx's point is something happens after the Industrial Revolution. So the machine does this, and the machine arrives, and now you can flip that equation. And now it's money plus commodities equals more money. In other words, you invest money in commodities to make more money, and the goal is more money. That's the telos. That's the telos of almost every part of human society and human growth. Vote for our party because we're going to grow the economy. For what? For what purpose? Well, because if we don't, you're going to lose everything. Like if we don't have growth in the economy, it's all going to go away. Or you need to grow your 401k, and you need to continue to grow your 401k, take a different job, work more hours so you can put more money in your 401k. For what? Like, no financial advisor, I should say very few financial advisors, help you think about the telos of all this. I mean, in many ways, they help you ignore that you're ever going to die. They just want you to get enough principal so you can, that you can live off the interest of that, with a sense that you'll die with the principal, but they're not going to tell you you're going to die. The idea is your financial advisor will say, and then as soon as you have this much money in, then you'll be able to live off the interest of that principal indefinitely. Well, I mean, what does that mean? And so, unless you're a Silicon Valley bro, where you can try to link your consciousness up to silicon and then therefore live forever because you do have enough money to never be in want, all of that is a kind of drive towards growth without any larger telos, and for sure without any kind of relationality, with any kind of sense that the goods of life are to be bound to one another, is to bear each other's suffering, that the goods of life look much more like a child and a parent than they look like, a billionaire supposedly never has to worry about anything but loses their soul in the midst of it.
Yeah. One of the places that was a bit uncomfortable in this book, Andy, is, other than the Counting Crows footnote shout out, you leveraged a whole lot of work that Tony and Josh and I did in the Emerging Church Oral History to tell all of us very hip, authentic, early aughts theological influencers of the postmodern church that we are idolatrous, thoroughly modern, capitalist scum. And I cried a little bit.
Did you? I'm sorry.
I was uncomfortable about how compelling it was. But
I'm sorry, Tripp.
But
if I could hug you through this software, I would.
I know, but I assume most of the people listening were at least told they should go listen to the audio documentary. So maybe you can take some time to tell the story of kind of the epistemological postmodern shift. For those of us that are like, oh, well, you got the baby boomers doing their thing and we're doing our epistemological postmodernism. But then when you ask about the question of stabilization and the dynamic one, that we're reproducing it again.
Yeah, I mean so really this is a classic writing problem where one little analogy all of a sudden births a long piece. Like I didn't go in thinking, oh, I have to do a riff on the emergent church reality that I was very much on the fringe of in the very late 90s and early 2000s. But what happened is there's just a powerful line from Rosa, and I'm really only working chapter, I think it's 14, right, of Resonance. Just that chapter I think is really fascinating. And he says something to the extent of, that what makes a society modern is not its epistemological connections or even its kind of senses of legitimacy, like institutional kind of senses of legitimacy. What makes you modern is dynamic stabilization. That's basically his point. It's like your society is modern, or you've escaped the modern epoch when you no longer are stabilizing yourself in modern ways. And so I just found that interesting because, some of us, Tripp, you're younger than I am, but we kind of came of age in this like awakening of evangelical pastors, which you guys do so well in the audio documentary laying out. It's like this group of evangelical pastors. So like in the context of this special century, so when the special century ends, all of a sudden you have these evangelical pastors who build mega churches, focusing not really on theology, but on direct marketing. Thinking about generational marketing is how they end up building these huge churches. So you can see in the arrival of the new neoliberal epoch, the idea is you're not just going to get constant growth, but we're going to try to pull away barriers so some people can win, and win a lot of growth. Like that now growth is not even going to be, kind of everything goes up. Some people are going to be super rich and other people, well, they're not. And it's going to be your fault because you suck. You didn't win. And don't cry that other people dominated. Well, we see that happen in the 80s in kind of evangelical, Baptist and all denominations have a bit of it, but then it becomes kind of non-denominational itself. And the idea is that if you kind of can become authentic enough and do away with your denominational structure, now we're at the end of the special century, so denominational structure doesn't seem to matter anymore. You could have this huge form of growth. You could take a church a la Rick Warren of, 6 families in a living room, and 10 years later have 10,000 people on a bunch of acres in Orange County. And the whole way of doing that was this kind of sense of marketing, but also this kind of focus on generation. So if you try to create a church just for baby boomers, you can do amazing things. And I think what you guys showed so powerfully, and Tony articulates just so well, is that it was from those people who basically had an issue. And the issue was another generation was coming behind. And if the whole point was you have to do church for a generation, you need to get your youth pastor and other leaders to figure out how you're going to create churches for Gen Xers after the baby boom. And then I think, what's really fascinating is that those people were like, we're not playing this game. Like they became critical of this and this, then a lot of kind of French post-structuralism came about and discourses of modernity where, these pastors that had funded and their institutions that had funded these emergent people were basically like, just find the Gen X method. The message can stay the same. And Tony does this so well. The method could stay the same. You just have to find a different kind of metaphor, different kind of way of doing things. And then, of course, what those folks did were like, no. The message is embedded in the mode of which it is shared in. And so there was all these like really heavy, lofty days of this being a postmodern reality and it being about epistemological shift and things like that. And I think it was really helpful intellectually, except something got us, which all the capitalist system gets us in some way. And the thing that got us is that the very same logic of escalation that Rosa thinks determines really if you're modern or not ended up coming into the emergent church as well. It's all of a sudden these book lines happen, these huge conferences happen. And then all these folks were like early adapters of Web 2.0. And all of a sudden you had blogs, and these were all functioning on Silicon Valley based escalatory logic. And so what occurred is something that the Berkeley sociologist Emmanuel Castiles talks a lot about, is on the third industrial revolution, where it becomes the digital platform, what ends up being the escalatory thing is personality. So you ended up having all these personalities. And so there's a certain way that at a philosophical level, they're trying to be postmodern. I do think that was intellectually helpful for a lot of people. But at a deeper level, there's a certain way you couldn't escape the megachurch womb in which you were born, and it became about kind of escalatory personality capital, and really big book advances, and what are your blog numbers, and like I remember coming, my career starting at the early days of Twitter in the height of the blogosphere, and you couldn't get a publishing deal unless you could show huge amount of some numbers of your social media followers, and now, like Baker recently told me, like, we don't really care. We don't care if you have a Twitter handle or an Instagram or not. We don't care anymore. But my gosh, in 2007, you needed to show that you had more and more numbers. So that's it was an analogy that ended up growing a lot more than I intended it to. But I think it illustrates this really quite well, that in a certain sense it was postmodern and pushing some epistemological categories. But maybe what even undercuts some of its prophetic possibilities is it got pulled into this huge machine of early third industrial revolution personality capital growth.
There are two things. You go on in the next chapter where you play out kind of a couple of different responses. One is like the techno-optimist response. Yeah. And then you have the identitarian response. And both of those have strong correlates, even archetypes of each of those I can think of people from the emerging church movement went on to do it. But before I get there, like you're naming something that I don't even know what to do. I already sent you to the first chapter of the book I'm working on, which is all really around this, that in many ways we have more and more of our energy is harnessed in the digital space. And the platforms that the digital space exists in are algorithmically mediated plantations for the drivers of everything bad.
Yeah.
And and so the sick part of it is vampiric to your finitude, but you have to do it to exist. And if you opt out, you're like choosing social death, right? And it sets up the sense that, if in the golden age of mainline Protestantism or even early evangelical movement of religion, so much of that was attached to kind of the form and techniques of these different tribes. And this is what the Lutherans do, here's what the Baptists do, here's what this is, right? And in that same period of that transition, you have like the Southern Baptists get taken over by fundamentalists who we used to make fun of when I was a Southern Baptist, and they had a process theologian teaching theology at Southeastern, and now the head of ethics at it is running interference for Stephen Miller and company, right? So like that group change, all of them have had these changes, but the shift that you see, wherever you are in the spectrum, are these shifts from kind of networks of institutions with predictable formats to a shift to personality or influencer driven or these kinds of things. And then people coalesce around it, right?
Right.
And when I think of the emerging church movement, specifically the emergent village, it was a decision when the leaders who were the personalities that started it said, we're intentionally handing off leadership to a new generation, which was identitarian in the sense of much more diverse.
Right.
It had a rather precipitous decline the moment the emerging church, the emergent village said, we're a network of friends. We should let other friends take the lead because this is us doing our ethos. And the moment that happened, it wasn't like those friends stopped being friends. It was everything else stopped. All the money for the events or the books or whatever, because they were like, but where's Brian McLaren? Or what's Doug doing? Or what's Nadia doing?
Yeah.
Like,
who are the personalities that that lock this in? Yeah.
And so what's fascinating to me is like in the emergent village story, even the recognition that was happening and deciding what do we do to avoid this was a self-destruct button, which has me constantly paranoid.
Yeah.
As someone who
needs to feed their kids. Yeah.
Yes. Like if I'm going to hit a self-destruct button, I gave up all social media and everything for Lent and I made less money.
Yeah. Right.
You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
I say that because one, you just reminded me of my deep complicity with the death dealing system. Well, it's always good to have confession at the beginning of a service, but I think a lot of times clergy or faith leaders at more traditional churches, they think, oh, I wish I was, right?
Sure.
Someone that was not so institutionally connected and you had, a big Substack where you could do this or do this. But what you're describing, that dynamic stabilization and the shift to essentially putting your own subjectivity as out for entertainment and connection.
Yeah.
That's something that it's hard for anyone to opt out of.
Yeah. It's really hard. I mean, this is the system that's got us. I mean, I do think, and maybe I'm being completely naive here, and maybe I'm just looking at one case, which is, my wife and her pastoral call, but there is a sense, like, I do think there's a temptation right now for pastors to think the primary place where your voice is needed is on the platform. So something happens nationally, and what you need to do is give your hot take, to be rude, or you need to make your statement about this. And that can come at the cost of your very vocation, the very call of the office to care for these people and to address this community. But you can see how the kind of way the whole system works is you don't get a lot of feedback, even from your denomination, for just faithfully helping this 80 people respond to the oppression, or respond to the dehumanization that's happening in their community, and prepare them to act faithfully and be disciples of Jesus Christ. You get way more capital for going on Facebook and giving your hot take and have everyone like it, and have people you don't know say, oh my gosh, Pastor so-and-so, this is just what I needed to hear, which then tells you, oh, I got to keep doing this. These people need this. And then now you're deep into the machine, and you're playing the platform more than what it means to preach the word and console the spirits of these concrete people in this congregation you've been called to. So there's a certain way the pastor may be able, or is set up more than a lot of other people in our society, to attend to a congregation of people, a gathered group of people, and to try to be faithful to them. But I think your point is our most primary social space now, where we gather, the public square, is the digital platformed public square. And if you have any sense that your paycheck is dependent on it, then you got to play the game, and it gets inside of you. And then we're all, techno-feudalists, as you were kind of pointing out here. We're all, and so it's a tough situation. But the whole point is to say, like, where you're referencing is because of the way the platform is created, and Castiles has done amazing work with this. I mean, when the early internet came around, I mean, particularly Internet 2.0, it seemed like it was utopia, both for neoliberals and classic liberals. Both of them were like, the internet. So the classic liberals were like, news and information can go everywhere so people can decide and be free. And neoliberals were like, you could make a shit ton of money off this. Like, there's money to be made in a digital space. But what that's created are these two very conflicted, and yet it's in a weird way connected responses, which is, one has created a kind of identitarianism, because the platform becomes a place to win recognition and attention for identities. So you see this across churches, where all of a sudden pastors, leaders become more identitarian, or it makes you a techno-optimist, like we've been saying. And those people tend to fight in a denomination. The techno-optimists are just like, we need identities. The others are like, we need justice for certain identities. Those people tend to fight. But where I want to point out, and this will make me very unpopular, is where they're actually linked is they're both essentially escalatory capital people, because a lot of this is being worked out on the platform, like you're saying, Tripp. And once you're on the platform and this is worked out in this social space of the network of the digital platform, then escalatory logic just takes over, and you are in some sense a capitalist, that you are trying to grow, in some ways grow recognition, grow influence. All of those things come about. And so I'd like us to kind of take a look at that. And if we really are going to be suspect of the ways certain capitalists, and I would particularly say just escalatory forms of growth malform us, then we need to look at how deeply they've just found their ways into all of us, and how inescapable it becomes in some ways. And then we do need a different kind of sense of the good, of a different kind of theological vision of what it means to live well, a different telos, a different grounding.
Yeah. And I wonder if you think it's fair here, when you think of the techno-optimists and the identitarians, to make a kind of a form content distinction, because say the techno-optimists, we believe in innovation and we're going to do design thinking and we want to be creative. And if we like use these tools and think about the nature of life and like how to communicate best and stuff, then we can do a better job doing what we're doing. The church can do better here. And the identitarians can sit there and go, yeah, like, look, we are finally at a time where where people get to be more of who they are. They can actually articulate it. It can be heard in the sanctuary before the holy and not packed full of shame. And we want to celebrate that. Right. And so in some ways, there's like part of the content of each, both like the gift of creativity and using it, and the gift of the multiplicity of identities of image bearers of the divine that we want to say yes to, right? And they each have a gift to give to the church,
right?
Because it seems that part of what you're saying is it's not about the content elements of those, it's that the form in which our optimism is driven by technology and creativity, or the form in which our embrace of different identities is, the form is idolatrous. It's the engine of dynamic stabilization that says something like, here's a new tool, and the more you use it, you become our tool. Or here's a new identity. The more that you own it, the more we have a market that we can monetize to. Right? And I wonder if there's a way for, especially within the church, to make that form content distinction, because I imagine there are ways in which communities that have learned to celebrate the difference of identities that are present around the Eucharist table could teach it to congregations that haven't learned how to do it yet. And others can be like, well, have you thought about what our liturgy looks like if we're engaging it in this creative way or this artistic way or these other kinds of things? And oftentimes the engine of modernity wants you not just to like encounter difference, it wants you to assimilate difference and kind of metabolize it into this engine. And I think that making a form content distinction in it, for me, it could be helpful, especially when my temptation to maybe those that I disagree with the most is just to roll my eyes and giggle.
Yeah. And in some ways, the way then we work with the people we disagree with is we end up falling into the very logic of escalation and being like, well, your churches are shrinking, or like there's a certain sense like you're not winning market share and you're not escalating growth, so you're let's look at you as suspect. But I'm absolutely with you. I mean, I think using even Our Lady of Vladimir, the picture that I use is the other side of the meme. If Artemis is on one side, Our Lady of Vladimir is on the other. I mean, first of all, it's beautiful. It's a creative picture. I mean, it's a creative piece, and all those Renaissance pictures that I was referencing, like it would be absurd to be against the drive of the human spirit to create something. And in the same way, I'm not trying to minimize that there's a distinctive identity experiences. And Castiles does a lot with talking about the importance of identity. And he's someone who's, a Catalonian who was like tortured in the midst of Spanish oppression, had to escape Spain. Like, he understands the importance of identity as a significant reality. What's so difficult about our system is how those become linked up without us even being aware of it with escalatory logic. And when that happens, well, then you end up being really susceptible to fertility gods as the justification for those things. And you end up nearing the necessity to burn yourself out to continue to grow the capital that can be extracted from those things. And you lose all gift exchange in that, like theologically, the sense of the kind of gift exchange, and everything has to be earned, won. I just think that you can't have this dynamic sense of what it means to be children of God, of what it means to find yourself in the child of Mary. As Paul would say, we're in Christ, where we have that kind of, we're growing into that. You lose all that in this need to escalate, this need to dynamically be stable. And yet, to your point, this is everywhere. So if we're not really clear theologically of how we're going to deal with that reality, we are going to be colonized by this escalatory capitalist logic that I'm trying to get us to escape from. But the point is, just like all forms of idolatry, is that we long for something good we never had. I mean, this is nostalgia. You long for something we never really had. And many of us, who like teaching seminaries or went to seminary, you kind of picked it up right away that this place used to have a past that was glorious and great, when chapel was filled and the cafeteria was running and full. And you just kind of wonder what it would take to get back to that, and that does then frame what you see as good. And my point is, it leads to a kind of Protestant form of fertility, of chasing fertility gods.
If innovation and identity politics aren't the gospel, what's going to grow the church? Mm-hmm. That's like it's like, here are the cultural canals that the anxiety of the breakdown of the golden age are running in culturally. And it's not just in the church, right? It's like rampant, or the kind of like techno-oppiness. We're going to innovate ourselves into a future. Right. And you see billionaires with straight faces saying crazy
crypto. If we can just get to crypto. Yeah.
Yeah. Or we're going to have the humanist utopia of pure identity, as long as everybody has the same theory of identity. And you sit to this bit, like after exploring it, you return to Solomon in chapter 5, and I didn't check the footnotes, but Jacques Ellul does something very similar with playing out with Solomon and his addiction to technology. And you have this bit of where you talk about Solomon's sin and playing out the golden era, where Solomon's kind of golden era was built on the accept, in scare quotes. Like, he loved Yahweh. He's a biblical Christian. Except he utilized high places, fertility cults. I'd say he loved Yahweh. He was probably the greatest king. Super smart, bigly in wisdom. He married Pharaoh's daughter. Right. She's from Egypt. But like, that was a practical decision. He had a huge, he's great at building chariots. Sold them to God's enemies. But, where Solomon, like, when you're just reading the story straightforward in Kings, like the historian does not report direct contradictions to the will of God, because it's all framed in the accept.
Yep.
But then later, the prophets point out that you basically made slaves of Israelites and came up with a new category called undocumented immigrant. I mean, something else, right? And so I wonder, when you start, I noticed that you opted out of drawing immediate historical parallels when it got to some of this. And you went back in time to avoid the uncomfortable bits of the way we do this, because you have some cool characters you're running through, like you obviously you do a lot. But like, what what are those places where me, our colleagues and friends have that kind of, that Solomon sin, that thing where we name it big and say, like, except there's this other side, but we're just going to minimize it and not make a big deal about it because, we're doing good here. We're doing the Lord's work.
Well, I mean, I think you can tell me where you want to go with this, Trip, but I just go back to what we've already said. Like, I feel that all the time. Like, I feel like, well, really my vocation is just to get up, to write, and to do what God has called me to do. And if no one ever reads what I write, that's it. But then I all of a sudden feel like, but except if no one ever reads it, then I'm going to feel like crap about myself. Then I might lose, what will happen after a review process, then I'm going to feel competitive with this, but like all these accepts come up, and they're both kind of psychological, existential, but they're also just the system of how this plays. Like thinking, like, I got 2 kids in college. I have to pay tuition for, I have a freshman, I have a junior. So I need 4 more years, man. I need 4 more years of speaking engagements. So I can get up here and say, well, I'm just doing a spiritual practice of writing things for the church. If the church needs it now, the church needs it now. Maybe the church will need it in 2 decades. Maybe the church will need it, my gosh, in 100 years if I want to be really, really spiritual and maybe think too highly of myself. But I can't determine, I can't control. Now we're in a different Rosa kind of vein here. I can't control what people think. And yet I feel it in me, except if no one reads this, and if Tripp doesn't release this podcast right as the book comes out, then I'm not going to get, speaking engagements for 2027. If I don't get speaking engagements for 2027, how do I pay Maisy's room and board? Like all of that comes up, and all of a sudden I'm thinking like, well, how do I market myself? Or my publisher says, you really need to update your website. And next thing you know, I have to do that. And some of that is just like being in a world where this stuff is just there. Like, it's kind of saying like, could you be a Christian and drive a car? Like, like you can't kind of not. But at another level, the accept really comes in there of how I justify how I need to play the game of escalation, because the Rosa point I think is really true, is that my biggest fear isn't that if people don't buy my books, say, man, I'm being really narcissistic about this, but if people don't buy my books, my biggest fear isn't I'll never be a best-selling author. That's not my fear. My bigger fear is that I'll lose what I do have. That's my biggest fear.
Well, yeah, the thing about it, that in the golden age, the love, addiction, and ability to assume growth helps you learn to accommodate to the rationality of the accept. Mm-hmm. And then once things hit the fan and people start looking around for what the problem is, some people want to, extend the accept. Think of the American church has always had to figure out a way to accommodate in the golden age the fact that we have the largest military on the planet and do all sorts of stuff, and worship an executed prophet who was a practitioner of nonviolence. So, but we'll accept. We haven't had any nukes since we did it, and the post-war order really great. I think it'd be a lot worse if we weren't in charge, Andy. So. That's good.
If everyone didn't have to live in relation to the American dollar, you know what I mean? Like, like
it would be worse.
Yeah.
So to me, one of the things I really appreciated about utilizing the story of Israel and Solomon and the conflict with the prophets and Baal is that is a ongoing narrative and wrestling of the people of God, right? Mm-hmm. Like at what point are we accommodating to civilization and its domination systems? What point are we becoming them? And at what point is fidelity resisting them? And it seems as if part of what you're tracking is in this are the new ways we've accommodated, the impact of having accommodated in the past, and then there's this invitation of what if we decided that this was killing us and we wanted something different? Mm-hmm. And that's when you, Luther, and the Theotokos take over.
Yeah.
So like and you had a beautiful talk about this at Princeton during the event with Rosa, but I wonder if you can kind of say a bit. You don't want to say too much because people need to go get the book.
Right.
Yeah. You've already laid it on thick that I'm releasing this right when the book comes out.
I've manipulated you to do that. Because if you don't, I will. It will all fall apart for me. My kid, I'm gonna have to pull my kids out of school. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
You got that Theotokos energy at the end of the book.
I do. Yeah, and I mean there is the kind of connection to the Elijah stuff in the sense that I think Elijah is like saying, as you said really well. I mean the problem with all these shitty kings. I mean, that's what I love the Book of Kings, because it really is just one crappy king after another, we're being told, with a little interruption of some good ones. But it's really a prophet's tale more than it's a priest's tale. And so more than it's really like the royal monarch's tale. But in the ancient Near East, again, I'm not an Old Testament scholar, but the king and the priestly apparatus are all interconnected, which is one of the really interesting reads. It's Brueggemann's, not mine. Is that one of the reasons Solomon needs to go marry the Pharaoh's daughter and bring her in is because it's realpolitik, man. Like if you're going to survive. But the problem with that is you bring the cult of Egypt into David's city, and so you end up bringing the bride brings the cultic system. And if this escalatory logic is cultic escalation, then really what you are getting is Solomon the great king, who lives in the logic of the relational, of what it means to be children before God, what it means to rest and have Sabbath, but also is taking in just the gods that demand fertility, sweat, blood, and trying to mix those things together. And in some way, the prophet can't help it. The prophet's just like, well, Solomon was just too damn good at it to really critique it too much. And he was the greatest king, David's son. And, so we're not going to give him too hard of a time. But everyone who comes after him, for the most part, they all are problems. And I try to turn to Luther's read of Mary because I find it fascinating. I mean, I'm trying to complete my meme here, and I showed the Our Lady of Vladimir Madonna picture. So I want to go into Luther's commentary on the Magnificat. And, Luther does this amazing thing with it where he just really drives towards the relationality of the mother and the child. And I think I want us to recover in a certain way and to try to have that form our imagination more than this escalatory growth, because it's a different kind of growth. And I'm trying to say, like, I'm not against growth. Growth is something human beings do. Like, we reference my dog getting a new puppy. As I'm writing this, I want this dog to grow, but this is not escalatory growth. I also don't want this dog to be, 900 pounds. I want it to grow well. I want it to grow into my life. I want to grow into this kind of communal sensibility. And I think Mary represents that. But Luther also wants to see Mary as the great prophet. Like she's the completion of Elijah. She is the great prophet because she heralds this word of this deep relationality that's coming into the world. And something we have to hear, she heralds, and Luther's writing this for the elector's nephew who will be the heir. And he's reminding him that God pulls down the powerful and lifts up the lowly. Like the Magnificat is about ripping down the powerful on their thrones and putting up the lowly. This is the business of God, that God does this because those who are on top have to serve escalatory growth and end up dehumanizing. And Yahweh, the God made known in Jesus Christ, does not abide that. The God who comes speaking to Mary will act and judge that and tear down the proud and put the lowly up. And Mary is the true prophet, the true teacher, because she hears the word and responds to it. And I guess this is, there's a very kind of Lutheran sensibility here where I'm calling us back to the word and the word and its relational dynamic at play. And that this system, the powerful who control it, they will hear the judgment of God at some point. And we will experience that as judgment too, but also as the grace of the embrace of being a child, of being in the communion of a deep relationship.
I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed your book, Andy. And I wonder, you're on sabbatical.
I am, yeah.
So that means that you have even more time to go talk about your book, places so you can pay for your kids' college.
So I can grow my 401k, baby.
So you can grow your 401k. So, that's what I'm saying. What's your website, Andy?
Yeah, follow me on all the socials.
Follow me on all the socials.
Click like below.
Oh, like, subscribe. You can become a member of the Substack. But no, when you think of the kind of problematizing the engine and assumptions that mainline and evangelical Protestantism have been running on in America, and you think of the kind of escalating speed at which we're moving beyond the background norms that generated them. Well, what if you imagine, like, 50 years from now, like when we switch into the next century, what questions do you anticipate us having to ask if we're, still working on being faithful, that right now, right? Like, a week or two after Canada's prime minister said out loud, the consensus that has been ruining things, it says out loud, like, what kind of questions do you think the church is going to have put on their agenda in ways we didn't before? If your book is like, we're coming to grips with the end of an era and the nostalgia for it, and now globally we're like, oh, we're not just over with that era. We're about to have a purge.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be really interesting in the sense of, like, if we do, we go with Carney's, I think really great speech, whatever day of Davos that was, but like the sense that the middle powers now need to, I think the great line was, the middle powers need to either get themselves to the table or they'll be on the menu, referring to Canada and in the European countries and things like that. I think one of the things that does to us, especially we could do this during the special century, that the first mode of the Christian century's response to the special century was to be civilization building. As America was building civilizations, we could build civilizations, and the social gospel critiques that, and then we reestablish and we kind of create this congregational form of civic religion, and then that gets critiqued and we disestablish, and then we're not really sure how to reestablish. But I think one of the things that's going to occur is that the post-war order, we could kind of assume it wasn't perfect. There were things happening that were unjust. As things became more and more globalized, there was a lot of people being hurt by it, but there was an essential good in the project. The kind of freedom we wanted to project was a good kind of freedom. And I think now we're going to live in a world where we're at kind of big civilizations, great powers in conflict, dividing up the world, and middle powers not knowing how to be. And that's going to put the church in America in a different place. There's been all sorts of talk about what does it mean to be a church inside of the empire, but it's very different when the kind of 20th century, first three and a half decades of the 21st century has been kind of like, we are the ones who push freedom and openness around the world, to if we want that, we take that, and it's in our hemisphere, so it's our right to take it. And everything in the world should be divided between the only other two powers we're kind of afraid of, or that we feel like maybe could bloody our nose. The rest of them, they can't do crap to us. Our legions are stronger than theirs, so they will pay us. They will pay us tribute and tariffs, or they will get smashed. And that puts right on the kind of front, what does it mean to be a Christian community, when that logic that maybe was there under the surface all along is so explicit, and there's just kind of no telling ourselves a different kind of story. I think that's going to be a very kind of different reality. So you're going to have these big civilizations, which we've had before, something like the Habsburg Empire or something, but they were Christian. They at least said they were Christian, and they were, kings running this because they were God's chosen ones. But what happens when you enter into kind of post that? You don't even have Roman emperors who believe that they're there because of the fate of the gods. You just feel like it's your billions of dollars that put you there, and you deserve to be there because you've beaten your enemies and through escalatory growth. I mean, like these are going to be major questions. So I think that to me, I mean, this is not going to surprise anyone. I think the theology of the cross is a larger kind of hermeneutic for how God is active, but how we also live together is going to be incredibly important. But maybe that's too on brand for me.
I'm going to ask a question, and we're going to see if he mentions theology of the cross.
The cross, right? Yes.
Well, I wonder if you can mention it into this one. So, what if you one of the other elements that even in Carney's speech, right? Like we all, where he gestures towards, we all knew we were fibbing, about the Christian century and the neoliberal order being good for everyone. We all knew that, but that's because we thought you were at least feigning morality with doing it.
Right.
It's just now you're not. Like it's so we can't go along and like retweet your self-grandiose statements about being champions of freedom and liberty when you can't even do it in your own country, let alone how you relate to other people. Right, like he's saying what liberation theologians from the global South that had our spy services from both parties overthrow democratically elected leftists have been saying for years. But it was out of the Canadian Prime Minister's mouth, and you know underneath it is this sense that, and this is something that I think we talked about not on a microphone because someone asked me, "Oh, you should ask your Christendom question to Andy." But if there's this decline of liberalism taking place and a kind of growing amnesia in Christendom of the kind of universal humanism that emerged, right? That was at least a gift of Christendom to the West. What do you imagine for the church's future? Because, you know, in one ways you could imagine, I don't think anyone articulates this one anymore, but there was a time where we're like, oh, Christendom helped, you know, get the liberalism off the ground like a booster rocket, and it falls off. But now we have humanism and universalism, and it's all there. And then others are like, well, you know, Christianity recedes, and as it recedes, so does its beliefs recede. But then you have the weird predicament that often the most vocal Christians are the ones receding the ethical commitments of Christianity faster than others. Because like good old Don Jr. said, we already tried the loving your enemy bit. Have we tried killing them yet? And to a group of Christians. And then there's this kind of ongoing fascination, projective fantasies of a Gen Z revival or this kind of return to Christendom or whatnot. But I wonder how you see the moral residue of Christendom and its status. Because if it's not there, so much of what we learned from the Christian century, I mean, like if you think of how mainline Protestants became obsolete, it's because the rest of the country decided we were right. They were like, oh, women should vote. We should integrate schools. Child labor laws are good. I know y'all thought y'all were being edgy for these for a while.
We all believe in this. We all believe in the social gospel. Yeah.
And so like what happens when those things become could become problematic or whatnot? Like how has these shifts we were talking about changed the way you think of the church's future?
I think the kind of dire read is to say that those things will continue to melt away further and further. And the question will be, I guess this is why I don't want us to get stuck in the cul-de-sacs of identitarianism or techno-optimism, because I think we're going to need to have as rich as a moral life as we can find. And I think if those can be disconnected from some of the capitalist infrastructure, then maybe they can help feed that. But I think that we've got to discover that in a significant way. The one thing I would say about Christendom that I think often gets maybe overlooked, and this is a kind of Philip Reif read that I really agree with him on, is that Christendom comes about, especially kind of Constantinian Christianity, comes about because there is this major switch from what he calls first culture to second culture, and there's a shift away from the harshness. Like very much kind of what we see in the president right now, which is kind of might makes right, fate and destiny determine all things. Maybe you see the seer to not make the gods mad, but for the most part, you can do whatever you want with your property. And you could there, you don't have to have any other moral horizon, then it's yours. But then in what he calls second culture, you have this rise of revealed religion that comes from Judaism and Christianity and then Islam, where you have a revealed religion. And that means belief is really important. That means the creed is really important because it encompasses the event of revealed religion. And so you do get Constantine who's like, well, I'm in charge of this. I need to pay for creeds to be written and discussions to be able to happen on really who is Jesus Christ, true God of true God, begotten and made or begotten and not made, because this is a kind of the moral codes that will hold together this society will be built on these forms of belief. So the question is, on the far side of this, even after a kind of Freudian critique of any of those renunciating forms of belief, what happens after that? And Reef thought there'll be a rise of new monasticism. There'll be a rise of authoritarianism, which seems to both kind of occur. And is there a way between some of those two extremes? And where will belief play within that? Like all our long conversations about Charles Taylor, can you have a world where belief becomes fully contested everywhere? And now you lose the kind of just in the ether of this moral code, like you're saying. If that disappears and yet belief has all been undercut, well, what larger narrative holds us together? And I've been quite amazed by that living here in Minnesota and seeing videos of the 2 killings that have occurred. And I don't know what my algorithm has done to me, but all of a sudden these right-wing people are on my Twitter feed and I'm watching their commentary on this video. And then of course I have other people on the other side who are giving this commentary, and New York Times is breaking it down. And I completely agree with the kind of, New York Times breakdown, the people not on the right who are framing this. But watching just a few of those videos, I don't think I'm a stupid person. Maybe some people listening to this will say I'm a stupid person, but I found my mind just flipped over. Like, I don't believe their take, but I find myself just kind of pulled into that. And there's really no shared story even. Like, these 2 people should not have been killed. Like, period. End of story. This was a evil, unethical act. And yet I'm seeing narratives spun of like, well, had to happen, or you should. People were threatened, and there's just no kind of shared narrative that I worry how you have a kind of shared moral story that even has something like, you cannot be shot 9 times in the chest by someone and say, yeah, protecting the country or something. I don't know. So I don't know. I don't know what happens after Christendom. I think there is a sense that all of the kind of desire, the kind of John Howard Yoder desire for a pre-Constantinian age to get to a post-Constantinian world, there is some fear of what are the larger kind of moral realities that we hold on to, that I'm not sure. I really am not.
Okay, here's one of those times where kind of Rosa's insistence that modernity's dynamic stabilization makes me want to know, like, what if at least the task for the church, when you recognize that, I don't know, naming idols. And the idols is the actual economic engine that has occupied not just like the economic space, but the way he talks about it, right? Generating culture, or the way it plays out in institutions, the way we're burning up the planet, burning down institutions, and burning out our souls. It seems that so much of the energy that should be channeled towards the engine that's creating the tension then gets channeled into topics that you can contest but never problematize the network of relations. So we could contest identities, or we could find the right innovation, but none of them ask, do we want to keep trying to live with this engine of dynamic stabilization?
That's right, yeah.
And that's why as someone who, as progressive as I can imagine, it gets on identity things, someone that, at least for mainline Protestants, very into technological innovation, can't keep up with. Evangelicals are just so, they spend so much time on it. But the reason I really love this book is when I think of the 50 years from now, one gift the church has is that we're a part of over 2 billion people that are in all the different nation states on this globe.
Yep.
And theoretically, our allegiance is to someone who is a performative contradiction to dynamic stabilization.
Yeah.
And just solidarity among Christ's own body when we recognize that this engine is killing the poor, the planet, and the very souls of upper middle class people in the top of it. That, like, economic idolatry, like, you know, Pope Francis was right. You know, this, like, and these popes back to back. As a Baptist, it's uncomfortable having two in a row I like this much. And Pope Leo echoes it. But I do think that that's something that, to me, is a place that more progressive and thoroughly Orthodox people there should recognize.
Right. But here's the challenge.
It's Jesus only either or.
Yeah.
He doesn't give an either or about anything but mammon.
Right. And here's, and this is where this is probably a good way for us to close, even though Tripp, I know you never like to close. We could just go on forever. But what I realized finishing this book is I had a problem. And the problem is that it's great to try to tell pastors, to tell ministry leaders, unhook from dynamic stabilization, unhook from the logic of escalation. But what do you do with the money? Because if you're a congregational pastor, you're still dealing with money. And, so that the book that will be coming out is I'm trying to look at money and really what is money. And one of the things that we're going to have to deal with to be able to unhook from the engine is we're going to have a different kind of practical theology, if you will, for lack of a better term, of how we deal with money, or a practical way that we minister and think about money, and money becomes formative to us. Because to kind of, echo Max Weber's assertion of the fact value split, or building off Hume's is ought. The crazy thing about money is that money in our kind of capitalist framework and the logic of escalation is more powerful than God, because God is just a value, not a fact. But money is both fact and value. Money is almost the only thing in a secular age that can move between fact and value. And pastors feel this all the time. Like, they want their communities to be all prayer. They want it to be about caring for people who are hurting. They want it to be about consolation of souls, proclaiming a kind of prophetic word like Elijah does. But then all someone has to say is, well, that's great, Pastor, but that roof is leaking. So let's get the grown-ups here who will deal in the realm of facts, because all your values about praying and God coming to broken, that's great until we have $100,000 debt on our hands and we need to fix the roof or something. And so we have to deal with that. And where I'll leave us hanging on for that conversation around that money book is that I actually think, and you may completely disagree with this, Tripp, I'm not so sure we can ever deal with money well, and particularly deal with the poor well, if we don't have some kind of vision of eternity in heaven. And I think of this particularly around Augustine, because Augustine, his whole ministry is, well, a deep part of it he's never afraid of talking about money, and money in eternity, and storing up treasures in heaven, and how we think about eternity and how we think about money. These things are all interconnected. So one of the ramifications of our secular age is when we've lost any kind of theological conception of eternity or heaven, we also can find ways of becoming co-opted by systems that can pull the poor out of any exchange of money. And Peter Brown, he's got these great lectures on ransom for the soul that are about Augustine and money. And one of the things he says is that Augustine is so against Pelagianism and Pelagius, because he thinks if Pelagius is right and you could perfect your soul, then you wouldn't have to give alms. And if you don't give alms for the forgiveness of your soul, the poor are left out of the exchange of money. And he just thinks that's a real problem, because you can't really follow Jesus Christ and you can't live in eternity with Jesus Christ unless you reckon with the fact that you have money. And that is a damn hard word for us. Like, that is a really hard one. But this whole logic of escalation, we can't get past it unless we figure out ways pastorally to deal with money. So that's my next project.
Well, no, because I think that's really helpful, because if money is the only category that does fact and value, is wonderfully gifted to transfer. It's also like underneath that is that it's the category of promise.
Yeah.
Like when you can move between the two, right? Which is what, like Peter Brown's point about Augustine is like when it can move, when the kingdom of heaven is the promise and the value, and it's also the fact of the church, right? Like that's running there. And what the point, and I actually it just came out this week, but the thing I did in the essay I did like on Rosa,
great essay,
was saying something like, when dynamic stabilization becomes like the unquestioned norm at the heart of all enactment, then all of the energy that used to be the orientus towards transcendence orients towards the imminent, right? And the imminent here is dynamic stabilization. It's not even like imminent in the good way.
No, right.
And so that like eternity now becomes seizable on the terms of the kind of aggressive orientation towards self, neighbor, world,
right,
etc. And I like, that's like that's what we have like the concept of the demonic for. Is something like that.
Yeah.
This is why we need more exorcisms. And maybe the beginning of the church's future is offering exorcism to Peter Thiel, and then he can make it trendy to the other billionaires.
Yeah.
And then when he renounces Satan and everything,
But I will, I know. I mean, it's funny, but I also would say, like, I feel like the way the system is built with me, I need an exorcism for how much I trust in money, because I really do trust in money far more than I trust
it's going to screw me and my kids up if I don't learn how to do it well.
Right. Yeah.
While knowing I'm betraying the only one that knows me completely and loves me completely.
Yeah.
I got big Judas energy.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's
subscribe
happening
to my Substack, invite Andy to come talk about his book.
Right. And there's a PayPal link below. Click that. But I think that is 50 years. Like, how do we unhook from this engine of escalation? Yeah. What I would say, especially to kind of mainline moderates and progressives, is the way we do it is we're going to have a deeper theological and kind of formational understanding of heaven. And that people will look very strange at me, but I think there's something to it. We have to be able to recover a sense of eternity, at least through the tradition. The only way you've been able to deal faithfully with money is by having a deeper sense of a reality of your responsibility to money next to eternity, not next to your 401k and the fact that you're going to live forever as a consciousness on silicone or whatever new invention they come up with.
Well, there you go. You heard it here first.
Yeah.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you, Tripp.
I hope you'll be able to talk to me after all these people invite you.
I know.
To speak.
Well, I'll probably maybe we can get together and I'll fly private. And,
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. All right. And after you really hit it big, then you can have the Eras tour, where you give a talk, but like in the first hour, it's like, this is the youth ministry, Andy. And then you have that Jungian transition to theology of the cross. And then you go social philosophy and economics. And then you end talking about money and eternity.
Yeah, exactly. In heaven.
Yeah.
And then we find a new way to do indulgences, and then
great idea.
Yeah, there we go. Crypto indulgences.
Praise the Lord.
Yeah.
All right.